Hi there, everybody. I hope you're doing well today. This video is going to start our unit where we start investigating more empiricist approaches to philosophy during the modern period. We'll start by looking at two figures that are especially well known for advancing this kind of empiricist project, John Locke and David Hume. So in this video, we're going to start by just giving a little bit of background about both of these figures. Then we're going to talk about debates about concepts versus debates about knowledge. This is going to introduce this first unit here. So just a little bit of background on Locke first. Locke lived from 1632 to 1704, and he was given an incredibly privileged education at Westminster and then Christ Church at Oxford. And he lived after Descartes. There was a little bit of overlap, but he also worked with people that were highly influenced by Descartes' work. Now, he also lived at the time of scientists such as Boyle and Newton, and he was incredibly influenced by the kind of progress they were able to make in investigating the physical world. Now, he also had experience studying medicine and working as a political advisor, so he's very much involved in a kind of practical approach of applying his knowledge to the world. In fact, he was a political advisor to a very close friend of Boyle at the time. Then he finally wrote an essay concerning human understanding in 1689. And it was published in 1690. Those are the selections that the pieces we're reading are from. Now, this essay was hugely successful during his own time. Locke's goals in this essay, as he describes them, he says, "This being my purpose," so he's telling you what his goal is. He wants to inquire, he wants to try to gain some insight into the origin, certainty, and extent of human knowledge. So where our knowledge comes from, what we can be certain is true and where that certainty comes from, and how much certainty we can get. What things might forever be beyond our ability to know with any kind of certainty. Now, once we hit that limit of certainty, he also wants to inquire into the grounds of degrees of belief. Instead of talking about what we believe with certainty, what we might believe only with probability, and what evidence might make it rational to believe that something is likely to be true in terms of our opinion and assent. But he says, given that that's his goal, to understand the nature of the mind and how it gains knowledge, he's not at present going to meddle with the physical consideration of the mind or trouble myself to examine what its essence consists. So here he's saying, look, is the essence of the mind thought or not? Is it immaterial or material? He says, well, it doesn't really matter. If physicalism is right, there's still the question of how the mind gains knowledge. If the mind is immaterial, there's still the question of how the mind gains knowledge. And what's the relation between experience and reason and knowing and probable belief? He doesn't need to answer questions about the philosophy of mind and physicalism and dualism and panpsychism in order to investigate how knowledge works. Moreover, he says he's not going to investigate by what motions of our spirits or alterations of our bodies we come to have any sensation by our organs. So how do the experiences get into our mind? Like, how do our eyes process light? How are the signals sent from the eyes to the brain? Understanding the constitution of those physical organs and processes doesn't help him answer how we know that certain ideas are true. And so he's just not doing a physical investigation. He's doing a philosophical investigation into the evidence for our beliefs. So as he says, the first thing he's going to do is inquire into the origin of those ideas, notions, or whatever else you please call them, which a man observes and is conscious to himself if he has in his mind. So the claim here is, we have the ability to think about certain things. I have the idea of a unicorn. I have the idea of a desk. I have the idea of glasses. I have the idea of a car. I have the idea of a mountain. I have the idea of God and math and numbers. That idea that I get in my mind when I'm imagining those things, where did that ability to think about that come from? How did that idea get into my mind? Notice that the question of the origin of our ideas is different than the question of the origin of our knowledge. I can have the idea of an alien even if I don't have any knowledge of whether aliens exist or not. And so this leads to his second inquiry. He's going to endeavor to show what knowledge the understanding hath by those ideas. So when I get those ideas, what knowledge can I get from using the ideas that are present in my mind? And what can I be certain of? And what evidence do I have in favor of my beliefs? And how far does my knowledge extend? Then lastly, he says he's going to make some inquiry into the nature and grounds of faith or opinion. So these things that go beyond certainty, that might deal with probability, for instance. So now let's take a quick look at the background of the other empiricist in the story, David Hume. So David Hume lived a bit later. He lived from 1711 to 1776. So this is toward the end of the modern period. He was an influential historian and essayist during his time, and he wrote several influential philosophical works. His first work was a treatise of human nature in 1739, but Hume was a little disappointed by the reception that he received in this work, and he thought this was largely because people just didn't understand what he was trying to do or what he was trying to say, and he thought that the fault was his. He thought that the style in which he presented the ideas was not the most helpful way for helping other people understand. And so later, he wrote 2 inquiries concerning human understanding and an inquiry concerning the principle of morals. This was an attempt to take that treatise on human nature, to take 2 central topics and split them into 2 separate treatments, and to present those same kinds of ideas in a new style that was more akin to his style in his essays, so people would understand them better and maybe engage with them at a higher level. And then posthumously, after he died, he published the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, which consists of 3 characters discussing arguments for the existence of God from reason, from experience, and then a 3rd character questioning both of those approaches, essentially being the voice of the atheist. And when you read through this dialogue, it's pretty clear that the atheist character is pretty much the voice of Hume, which is why a lot of people accuse David Hume of being an atheist at the time, because, well, I mean, he most likely was an atheist given what he's written. But Hume's work, his philosophical work, was also cited as an influence for several other figures after him, such as the economist Adam Smith. The philosopher Immanuel Kant said that Hume awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. Philosopher Jeremy Bentham, one of the founding figures of utilitarian ethical theory, was incredibly influenced by Hume's work. And even the biologist Charles Darwin cited Hume as a huge influence on his approach to the theory of evolution by natural selection. So what kind of views did Hume defend? So he was well known for defending a number of influential ideas, including a kind of philosophical naturalism. So Hume was incredibly influenced by people like Isaac Newton, who discovered natural principles like the laws of gravity that govern the behavior of physical objects, could be used to understand how they behave. And Hume's goal was try to discover analogous natural principles that govern the behavior of the human mind. Hume's idea here was that the human mind was not some supernatural thing beyond our comprehension. Rather, the human mind was itself a part of the natural world and governed by the same kinds of principles that everything else is. It had regular behavior that if we just found the laws of the mind as opposed to the laws of physics, we would be able to understand how the mind operates. So in this way, you could think of Hume as not only engaged in a project of philosophy, but also an early work in human psychology or cognitive science, trying to understand the underlying principles that guide our thoughts and beliefs, desires, its emotions, and everything that goes on in our mind. Now, Hume was also an empiricist, both in terms of concept empiricism and knowledge empiricism, which we'll talk about in just a little bit here. And he also has a number of skeptical tendencies. From what I said about the dialogue concerning natural religion, one thing he was skeptical of was the ideas of religion, but he was skeptical about a lot of other ideas too. So Hume was skeptical about a lot of ideas that people talked about, like, for instance, philosophers often talked about the self or substances and the modes of substances. And Hume often thought that these philosophers or scientists appealing to a number of these metaphysical principles, he thought they were just talking gibberish, that these ideas didn't make any sense because they went beyond anything we had experience with, and so we didn't really have any meaning that we could attach to these words. He also raised a number of skeptical worries about our knowledge concerning, for instance, religious knowledge, but also even scientific knowledge having to do with our beliefs about the future and principles of causation. We'll come to that a little bit later in the course. There is, however, a lot of controversy in the literature about how best to understand these skeptical tendencies that Hume seemed to express. Hume is also very famous for defending a view known as moral sentimentalism. Hume didn't believe that there were any God-given eternal principles of morality, and he didn't think that there were any innate principles of morality sort of stamped in our mind that we discover with our reason. On Hume's view, the source of our moral beliefs comes from our own experiences and our own reactions to thinking about and experiencing certain actions in the world. And so when we describe things as good or bad, right or wrong, we are actually not describing any mind-independent, transcendent moral truth. We're instead just describing our own sentiments and passions that we feel in reaction to the actions that people take or the actions that we think about. We're describing our own internal psychology in a sense. Now, there are some complexities and difficulties there, but that's a rough overview of the kind of approach that he took. Notice in all of these, there's a big emphasis on experience. All right, now, and that brings us to this debate that we briefly discussed between rationalism and empiricism. Remember, the rationalist tends to emphasize the importance of this faculty of reason in various philosophical contexts, whereas the empiricist tends to emphasize the importance of our senses or experience. That distinction, though, is much messier and more complicated than we've seen so far, and things get especially messy when you attempt to look at the specific views of a specific philosopher. And this is because philosophers can differ in the degree to which they emphasize the importance of reason or experience, and moreover, philosophers might place a higher importance on reason in some contexts while placing a higher importance on experience in others. So someone might think reason is especially critical for understanding our mathematical knowledge, while maybe thinking experience is critical to understanding our knowledge of the physical world. Similarly, for many philosophers, there might be many contexts where reason and experience must work together in an interesting way. And so the views of any individual philosopher, including Descartes, the supposed paradigm rationalist philosopher, even if they tend to one side of this debate, oftentimes their views are much more complex and subtle than what could be captured by trying to apply this very simplistic distinction. And so with that, we're going to complicate this distinction between rationalism and empiricism a bit by distinguishing two different kinds of debates. The first debate is about our concepts, or the ideas, the ability we have to think about things in the world. Concept empiricism is the theory that all the concepts in our mind, our ability to think about unicorns and desks and cups, computers and cars and mathematics and God and logic, all of those concepts are ultimately derived from prior sense experiences that we've had and from our reflection on those experiences. Now, concept nativism, which is often associated with rationalism, this is the theory that at least some, potentially many of our concepts are in some sense innate and are not derived from prior sensory experiences. We don't get them from the senses. Somehow these ideas, we're able to think about these things innately. It's built into our very nature. Now, how does it get built in or stamped on our mind innately? During the modern period, the nativist answer was usually that God imprinted these ideas on us. Think about like Descartes. He thinks we're born with this idea of an infinite substance, God, and this idea is put there by God as kind of like the signature of the artist on their artwork. Now, more contemporary thinkers who think that we have some innate concepts, they usually won't appeal to God as the thing that put these ideas in our mind innately. They'll usually think about evolution as a process by which our minds are programmed to have some of these ideas innately instead. Now, this debate about concepts, though, is distinct from a debate about knowledge. So knowledge empiricism is the theory that all human knowledge is ultimately justified by sense experience. So here, sense experience isn't what gives you the ability to think about certain things. Rather, sense experience is what serves as your evidence for coming to have knowledge that those ideas are true. Now, knowledge rationalism is the theory that at least some, potentially much, human knowledge does not ultimately need to be justified by any sense experience. It does not need sense experience to serve as the evidence that indicates that these ideas are true. Where does our evidence or knowledge of these things come from if it's not from sense experience? Well, the idea is we have this faculty of reason and intellect and understanding or intuition that allows us to know that these ideas are true directly without appealing to any sensory experience to come to know them. That's the kind of rationalist view of knowledge. So that's all for this video. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.